Are our moral and ethical failures more a result of physical desires and temptations, or a lack of spiritual awareness? What is our main purpose in life? Is it to overcome the physical world and achieve spiritual understanding, or to fully engage with and improve the physical world? And these are quite deep questions. Do you think that physical suffering can have a higher spiritual purpose, or that it's something simply to be avoided and alleviated? And when you consider what makes a person truly good or virtuous, do you think it's more about their physical actions, or their spiritual intentions and beliefs? And the last question, does engaging in physical pleasures and comforts distract from or diminish from your spiritual growth and development? Those are really deep questions that probably is hard to answer. But the fact is that those answers should probably be much harder to choose from than they are, because there is no right answer to these questions. It's not an either-or question. And this is what's called a false dichotomy. It's a false choice between two answers. And it's a handy trick that people use to try and channel you into their way of thinking. Like, is it science or faith? Are you a conservative or Democrat? Do you believe in climate change, or are you a climate change denier? These are questions. You should always be careful of these kinds of either-or questions, because there's almost always more than two options. And in this case, I'm asking these questions because I wanted to bypass your sort of critical thinking. I didn't want you sort of coming up with the answer that you think that I might want to hear. And your answers to those questions will often give you a hint to an imbalance in your thinking and in your beliefs. What I'm talking about today is the fancy pants name is called spirit physical dualism. It's a bit of a complicated thing, but it's simply the idea that the spirit is good and the physical is bad. And the question is, why should anyone care about this topic? It's a bit of a weird one, but the truth is, this idea affects absolutely everything. And I mean everything. It affects how we care for the environment, how we see our bodies, how we value marriage, how we approach technology, whether work is just a job or whether it's actually a vocation, whether we can truly take pleasure in art or music, even whether we see any point in caring for our community. This question is so important. It was probably about 10 years ago, I had a profoundly life-changing revelation. I was listening to a guy by the name of John Piper, and he was talking about something called Christian hedonism. And in my mind, those two words just don't go together, because basically hedonism is the love of pleasure, and Christianity, as I understood it, is at its core about denying yourself and renouncing pleasure over spiritual matters. So it shocked me when I heard him give these really good reasons for why God wants us to be Christian hedonists. And up until that point, I'd always seen the physical and the spiritual in conflict with each other. And as I looked around, I noticed that most Christians seem to have that same way of looking at the world, that same sort of false dichotomy, thinking that we have to choose between these two opposing forces at work in the world, what's called dualism. And we think we've got to choose between pleasure or the Christian life, the physical world or the spiritual world. And it turns out that this false dichotomy has it actually has a really long history. There was a religious system in the first century BC called Gnosticism, which it formed around early Christian and Jewish sects. And essentially, Gnostics believed that our material existence, they had some really weird ideas, but that our material existence was flawed or evil, and that we needed to kind of gain this hidden knowledge, or gnosis, that's where the word Gnostic come from, in order to overcome the world. And the early church condemned this way of thinking as a complete heresy. And in fact, 1 John was actually written as an answer to this whole dualistic way of looking at things. But despite the early church's attempts, Gnosticism's teachings that the physical world was evil and that the spiritual was superior to the physical spread far and wide, reaching actually as far as China. And unfortunately, it's actually continued in the background within the worldwide church throughout the centuries. And the reason why the early church came out so strongly about this being a heresy is that it's such a subtle idea. And like all heresies, what Paul calls doctrines of demons, it's a subtle idea that is so close to the truth that if you're not careful and you don't think carefully about it, you can actually easily adopt it. I adopted this idea. We want to believe this idea because it puts us back in control of our salvation. It's no longer about dying to self and putting our faith in Jesus. It's about learning to deny yourself and keeping your autonomy. It's something that you can do if you put in enough effort. But even deeper than this dualism denies the goodness of creation in Genesis. It echoes the snake's words when he said, "Did God really say?" But Genesis 1 is really clear. At the end of each day, God said that what he had made was good. And then at the end of day 6, he emphatically declares that what he had made was very good. And this is so fundamentally important to the way we live and the way we live our lives and the way we see this world. By saying this, that what he had made was good, God was communicating something important about the essence of the physical world and how much he loved his creation. Everything he had made was very good. The land, the water, the sky, the heavens with its celestial bodies, animals, birds, plants, trees, and humans, all very good, with no reservations. And this is also important, it wasn't just good because he said so, and so we must believe it. It was good because of how he made it. He was stating the fact of its goodness. And there's many layers to this goodness, and I'll look at these layers a bit deeper next week. But one of the most important aspects of next week, if I'm not preaching heresy here and you're going to invite me back, and one of the most important aspects of this goodness is found in Romans 1:19-20. As Paul talks about mankind, he says, "For what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from his workmanship, so that men are without excuse." And we can clearly see God through his creation. And then again in Psalm 19, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." God is revealed and glorified through this physical world that he created. And there's 3 key moments in history where God underscores the goodness of this physical world. The first is, as we've seen, his very good declaration at the outset of creation. The second is the Christmas story, the incarnation. Jesus was born in a human body. God became flesh. And this is significant because this was the moment that God laid aside his divinity, humbled himself, and became flesh. And if the point was his teachings, if it was just about imparting knowledge to us, he could have just stayed spirit, appeared as a human, imparted all the necessary information, and then left. But John 1:14 says very clearly, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word, the Logos, God, became flesh. And the word for flesh here is the Greek word is sarx. And it's the same word that Paul refers to in Romans 8:8 when he says, those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. It's got a bit of a negative kind of connotation. John could have used, there's a Greek word soma, which also talks about the body. But it has these much less negative connotations, but he used sarx. God met us in our flesh. He became a physical being. God became flesh. Why? Because he wanted us to know that what he had made, this physical world all around us, was good. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. We all know that. John 3:16. And God loved the world so much that from that moment on, Jesus, the third member of the Trinity, essentially permanently united himself with his creation. What theologians, their fancy pants word is called the hypostatic union. That's God united himself with his creation. That's profound. And the third underscoring of the goodness of the physical creation was the moment that Jesus rose again. After suffering an incredibly painful, tortuous physical death, he came back with a body, a glorified body, but a body nonetheless. He could have just ditched this whole physical body idea if it wasn't important, but he was reiterating Genesis 1 again, that everything that he had created, this physical world around us, is very good. And before I go any further, I just also want to address an elephant in the room, also a possible sort of error in the way we think. Jesus coming in the flesh, it wasn't an afterthought. His coming in the flesh, it wasn't something that God had to quickly do to kind of remedy, oh no, everything's kind of gone wrong. Oh, send Jesus, he'll sort it out. It wasn't a backup plan. And it's really important to understand because it was always the plan from the beginning. From before he created the world. He knew he would be born in a dirty stable, nursed and loved and cared for by the woman that he had created 1.5 decades earlier. And he knew that he would die on a cross and rise again. It was no backup plan. And you also have to understand that this idea of God becoming flesh it's actually an incredibly contentious idea. Almost all religions throughout the world have rejected the idea that God could actually become fully man. Out of all the world's religions, apart from Christianity, Hinduism possibly comes closest with the idea that God, he becomes an avatar, which is basically like a representation of God in human form. Divine God essentially appears in the form of a human, but he doesn't become a human. But as Christians, we believe that God set aside his divinity, his omnipotence, his omniscience, his omnipresence. He limited himself somehow and became a man with all the frailties and the difficulties that come with being human. And you see, that's kind of where the contentious part comes in, because we feel on some level that God could never really become human, that's kind of beneath him. God is too pure to be tainted by the flesh, by the physical. And for pretty much all religions, this is impossible. Their versions of God require some kind of magical moves to make sure that God is never contaminated by the flesh, by dirty flesh. And there's even some Christian theologians who they've missed the point, and they've said that Jesus never really came in the flesh. He just appeared to be in the flesh, like the Hindu avatar God. They say that Christ just came into a man called Jesus, possessed him temporarily, and then obviously even left him at the point of his death, because obviously God can't suffer that kind of indignity. It sounds very New Agey, but there's actually Christians who have this way of thinking. But they've missed the very heart of God. They've missed the whole point. God came in the flesh. He didn't pretend to be in the flesh. He didn't just appear to be. And infinite God didn't just insert himself into flesh. He became flesh. He became physical. And we find it hard to see God as anything but holy, pure spirit, separate from us, but not us. We see this hierarchical world to the way of thinking about the world, that spirit is up here, flesh is down here. It's hard for us to truly comprehend that God could become flesh. And I think part of the reason for our difficulties with this idea comes from a misunderstood reading of Romans 6 and Galatians 5, that our bodies themselves are in conflict with the spirit. Galatians 5:16, it says, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." I read this in the early part of my Christian walk, and this really got me. And up until probably a decade or two ago, I thought this was talking about our bodies, that our bodies, the physical world, is in conflict with God. But now I understand that the flesh being spoken about here is the part of our being, and not necessarily even the physical part of our being that sets itself up against the things of God. The flesh, what the Bible sometimes translates, in the flesh in this case, what the Bible sometimes translates as sinful nature, twists and misdirects our natural desires so as to make them destructive and degrading. And a real-world example of the difference between flesh being spoken about here and the sort of good fleshiness of our body would be in the area of sexual desire. Because sex is this beautiful thing between a husband and wife. It's something that God created as a way for us to show our love for each other in a physical way. But then there's lust, and lust, it's not another name for sexual desire. It's what the flesh does to sexual desire, making it an instrument of self-gratification and exploitation rather than committed love and the miracle of new life. And the Greeks and the Hebrews, they had very different ideas of what constituted a person. And unfortunately, the Greek view is kind of the one we've adopted. And their way was very similar to this whole Gnostic dualism that we've spoken about. Man is made up of different parts, all vying for dominance, while the Hebrews viewed man as a whole. And their word for happiness and fulfillment reflects this holistic view. The word shalom, often very simplistically translated into English as peace, is a much deeper concept than that. It encompasses the fullness of our lives. To dwell in shalom is to enjoy living before God, to enjoy living in one's physical surroundings, to enjoy living with one's fellows, and to enjoy life with oneself. This is the picture that we should be striving for when we look at ourselves. God made a good physical world. He became flesh, and having died, he rose again in a resurrected body, underscoring the goodness and the intentionality of this physical creation. But so what? I read a book the other day. The guy was saying, you got to ask, so what? What I want to do is I want to point out just some of the areas where this dualistic thinking, this false dichotomy is having a huge effect in society at the moment. Areas where we can, if we recognize its tendrils, make changes in our thinking and in our lives. And I could probably spend a whole morning on each one of these things, but I'm just going to give you a quick teaser just to encourage you to think deeper about all these areas in our lives. And the first place to start with is the church itself. Satan trembles at the idea that we might begin to see this. He doesn't want the church to truly get this, to get the implications of this. The idea that our flesh, our bodies are somehow bad and the spiritual is somehow good is an idea that Satan loves to spread because it neutralizes the church where it can make the most difference. And it insulates unbelievers from coming to God. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that the church is so heavenly minded that it's no earthly good. When all we're focused on are the spiritual aspects of life, we miss out on the ability to speak to and to love people where they are at. I remember soon after I became a Christian, I remember hearing the story about an evangelist who left his family and to go and preach the gospel, evangelizing to countless numbers of people before eventually dying of exhaustion. And the people who were talking about him spoke, oh, wow, how amazing is that? It's amazing. But all I remember thinking about was how unbalanced he was and what a sad life his was. He may have won souls for Christ, but to what kind of life were they invited to? One that definitely didn't value family or rest or pleasure. And I wonder how long-lasting was the fruit. And Jesus' words to the Pharisees comes to mind where he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you've succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." So what gospel are we preaching with our lives? When unbelievers look at us, do they see someone who values the goodness of this good creation that God has given to us? And then another sort of common distortion that's rife in the church is the impression that church workers, especially evangelists, missionaries, pastors, priests, ministers, have a higher calling than other workers. And the truth is, there's very little in the Bible to support this way of looking at things. But during the Middle Ages, a religious life as a monk or a nun was widely considered holier than our ordinary lives. And even though most churches' doctrines affirm the equal value of the work of lay people, this distortion remains influential in most churches today. In the Bible, God calls individuals both to church-related and non-church-related work. And you probably would have heard Christians talking about, with a certain amount of pride, I've been called into ministry. And of course, it's important to know that what you're doing, God is calling you to do that. But we must never think that a church leader is somehow more important because they're doing spiritual work. And I must say, I've always loved that about Brett. He's always He's always wanted us to call him Bishop. He's always pushed that away. Like when people try and put him up on a pedestal, he's pushed that away. And when they call him pastor, he says, let's call him Bishop. No, I'm joking. Yeah. But the truth is, we are in fact all called to ministry to a greater or lesser extent. And sometimes that calling is focused entirely on the church, as in a full-time pastor. And sometimes that calling is our vocation. But either way, our work can be redemptive to the people that we serve when we know that we are called to serve in the place that we are in. And maybe we should be praying as carefully about where in the job market God wants us to be. And this also opens the doorway to a conversation about art. If we see the physical as less important, things like art and beauty start to become redundant. Once upon a time, the church saw the expression of art as a natural outworking of a life that is focused on the glory and the beauty of God. And lives were spent creating works of art and music and architecture and gardens and designs and books. And this was nowhere more evident than in the church. And in the church buildings, I mean, you see the detail in some of these old church buildings. The detail is exquisite. They understood this. And there's a few books that I really would encourage you to read that basically point out that we as Christians should be at the forefront of artistic expression. There's a book called Addicted to Mediocrity by a guy by the name of Frank Schaeffer. Amazing. We are addicted to mediocrity in this world. We should be, as Christians, at the forefront. His dad also wrote a book called Art in the Bible, Francis Schaeffer, Art in the Bible, also profound. And then another really good book to read about this whole thing of art and faith, A Theology of Making by Makoto Fujimura. What these guys point out, art is as much a redemptive aspect to our lives as worship. Art is worship. But we see the extravagance of art as Christians, because of this dualistic thinking, we see the extravagance of art as wasteful. Much like Judas did when Mary came along and poured this alabaster jar of perfume all over Jesus. Art is only wasted when the physical world has no value itself. Another huge area where the church has dropped the ball over this distortion is in the area of the environment. The church has somehow adopted the idea that this world is destined for the trash can. That we need to get through this life as unscathed as possible and make it to heaven, that place up in the clouds where we sit around on these clouds and play harps and sing worship all day. These caricatures of our life here on earth and heaven are so distorted. We're called to invite heaven into the places that we are in to help facilitate God's kingdom. And our first mandate in the garden was to care for and steward the earth, not because she is our mother, whatever that means, not because we need to be afraid of climate change or because it's in our best interests. We need to care for the environment because that's one of the core reasons why God put us on this earth. And God calls us to be good stewards of this physical world that He has placed in our hands. Another very contentious thing at the moment is the idea of gender and gender fluidity. And it seems it seems to come from a place of affirmation and body positivity, but actually there's nothing more directly opposed to the body, to the goodness of our bodies than this idea. And again, this has its roots in Gnosticism, that the physical world is evil and that we get to transcend it. It creates this distinction between gender and our birth sex. Your birth sex is what your body tries to impose on you, but you are not your body. You're more than your body. The real you is what you feel inside. So you get to decide what's real and what's not. Reality, this physical world all around us, doesn't get to impose on you. And this is anti-body, anti-physical. There's nothing affirming or positive about it. And there is a whole lot of vitriol around this idea, and we as Christians, we don't want to be adding to it. We shouldn't be adding to this. Because the truth is, these are people who are struggling with a view of themselves, and they've adopted a way of thinking that isn't, it's hurting them. And we as Christians, we need to understand the root, the underlying worldview that supports this way of thinking. And I wasn't sure whether to say this, but this is also a social media-driven problem. When we let our children be exposed to social media at a really young age, we're opening the doors to these kinds of struggles for them. And today, whether you realize it or not, Satan, he is going for broke with this idea that the physical world is bad and the spiritual is good. He's moving the whole world away from the flesh, from the physical. Society has these really big aims. It's imagining a perfect world again, but one where God doesn't feature. Society has, for the last probably 100 and something years, been driven by something that's called humanism, which is defined, this is the definition, a democratic and ethical life stance which affirms that human beings have the right and responsibility to give meaning to and to shape their own lives. Sounds amazing, sounds good. Has all the right words, it sounds appealing, democratic, ethical, life-affirming rights, responsibilities, but the heart of it is decidedly anti-God, that we are the captains of our own souls, that we get to shape our own lives. But now, on top of humanism's precarious and it must be said, crumbling foundations, society has begun aiming and building towards a higher truth, what's called transhumanism. And this is the idea that technology can transform the human flesh into a new being, one that isn't hampered by the flesh, an existence that's above the human, not constrained by our physical limitations. We are not our bodies, transhumanism says. We can't allow our bodies to dictate to us. Our bodies don't define who we are, our gender, our character, our genetics, our future. And this is an idea that was put forward first by the Nazis as they aimed for this idea of a higher race. And that's at the heart of transhumanism. So if you look around, everything is moving towards that goal. Everything is moving online as a first step. We have online personalities and characters. We don't have avatars. We are avatars. We spend the majority of our time not with people or ourselves or God. We spend the majority of our time in an artificial world with no flesh. Our TV screens, cell phones, iPads, Apple Vision, AI, ChatGPT, these are all aiming for a world that is no longer flesh. And yet God became flesh. Maybe he was a bit old-fashioned, a bit outdated, a bit out of touch with the times, a bit of a fuddy-duddy maybe. Or maybe, just maybe, he's pointing us to a truth that's much deeper than our technological bent. The physical world that God created is good. Very good, in fact. When he chose to create a world, this is profound. When he chose to create a world of another substance to himself, God is spirit. He chose to create this physical world around us, a whole different substance to himself. There was a purpose and a plan. When he was born as a man and died a physical death and then rose again into a glorious resurrected body, there was a purpose and a plan. That purpose was his glory. And that plan was our salvation, our enjoyment, our abundance, our shalom. For God so loved the world, this good world that he created, that he gave his only Son so that whoever believes in him will have eternal life. And that eternal life is as much for the here and now as it is for the hereafter. So let's invite God into the spaces that we are in, the part of the world that you inhabit. Let's invite God's kingdom into our lives. Let your kingdom come, Lord. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Come, Lord. Next week, I'm going to look more specifically at what was so good about this physical world that we find ourselves in, and how we can live more fully, more incarnationally, how we can inhabit the shalom idea of what God has created for us.